January 1945. A pale winter dawn settles over a temporary medical camp in western Germany. The air smells of antiseptic mixed with damp earth. Inside a canvas tent, German nurses stand in silence, hands folded, eyes lowered. Their white uniforms are worn thin from years of war. They are prisoners now, and they are waiting for cruelty. They had been taught to expect it. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted a terrifying picture of American soldiers. Undisciplined brutes, driven by hatred, contemptuous of women, and merciless toward their enemies. German nurses, many of whom had served in field hospitals near collapsing fronts, had heard these warnings over and over again. If captured, they were told humiliation would follow. Abuse would be inevitable. Respect would not exist. But as the sound of boots approached the tent entrance, what unfolded did not match the stories they had been fed. This moment, and the thousands like it across a crumbling Germany, would strike at the very heart of an ideology built on fear and dehumanization. By late 1944, Germany's medical system was fractured. Hospitals were overwhelmed, supplies were scarce, and nurses, many of them conscripted or reassigned civilians, were pushed into frontline service. As Allied forces advanced, they encountered thousands of wounded Axis soldiers and the medical staff who cared for them. How these captives were treated would become a quiet but powerful counter-narrative to years of ideological conditioning. According to the U.S. Army Medical Department, captured medical personnel were to be treated as non-combatants under the Geneva Convention. This meant that nurses, regardless of their nationality, were to be protected from retaliation and degradation, and allowed to continue their work where possible. On paper, it was policy, but in practice it became something far more profound. The German nurses in that tent expected shouting. They expected their personal belongings to be confiscated, to be forced into hard labor, or worse. Many braced themselves for harassment. Some had even burned documents and insignia days earlier, terrified of what would happen if their roles were discovered. They stood rigid, preparing themselves to endure whatever was coming. Instead, an American guard entered calmly. His rifle was slung low, not raised in a threatening posture. He removed his helmet before speaking. The orders he gave were brief, procedural, and surprisingly respectful. The nurses were told where to stand, where to continue their duties, and most shocking of all, that their medical work was still considered valuable. There was no mocking, no threats, no insults. Red Cross inspection reports from early 1945 describe U.S. run camps where German nurses were allowed to retain their uniforms, personal hygiene items, and their professional roles. One report even noted that female medical personnel were treated in accordance with their status, with strict discipline enforced upon guards to prevent misconduct. For nurses who had spent years under a regime that equated power with brutality, this display of restraint was deeply unsettling. And then there was the food. It became a recurring symbol of this unexpected reality. Meals arrived on schedule. The bread was sliced evenly. The soup was hot. The portions were consistent, not luxurious, but always sufficient. In several documented accounts, German nurses remarked on the sameness of the American rations. There was no favoritism, no punishment through hunger. Everyone ate the same food, at the same time, under the same rules. For women who had watched civilians starve in hospitals ration mere scraps, this simple consistency felt almost unreal. Food, once a tool of control and hierarchy, had become a symbol of order without cruelty. Beyond basic necessities, professional conduct crossed ideological boundaries. U.S. Army nurses often found themselves working alongside their former enemies. While direct, personal conversations were limited, a shared professional identity bridged the gap. Medical logs from the period showed German nurses assisting in surgeries on wounded American soldiers, and American doctors relying on the training and experience of their German counterparts. One captured nurse later wrote in her diary that she was never spoken to as an inferior, only as a nurse. This was not what they had been prepared for. Historian S.P. Mackenzie, who has written extensively on the treatment of prisoners of war, notes that American camps often shocked Axis prisoners precisely because of their predictability. Yes, there were rules, and they were enforced, but they were not arbitrary. Punishment existed, but it followed a clear procedure. For German women who had been raised under a system of harsh, authoritarian discipline, this absence of constant, unpredictable fear was completely disorienting. The transformation was subtle, but it was irreversible. In camp diaries later recovered by historians, German nurses described a growing internal conflict. They wrestled with a confusing contradiction. If the Americans were supposed to be morally inferior, why did they respect medical neutrality? If democracy was weak and decadent, why was discipline maintained so effectively without the use of terror? The answers weren't spoken aloud in the camp, but they settled quietly day by day with every calm order and every evenly portioned meal. The sound of the camp bell became another powerful symbol. It rang not to signal punishment or to instill fear, but to mark routine meal times, roll calls, work assignments. The bell didn't scream authority. It simply marked the structure of the day. And in that steady, predictable sound, many of these nurses began to sense a different kind of system, one that could function without ideological rage. By the time the war finally ended, many of these women were repatriated or transferred under international supervision. In interviews conducted years later, a consistent theme emerged from their testimonies. First came confusion, and then came reflection. The enemy they had been taught to fear had not behaved as expected. The caricature that propaganda had built had collapsed under the weight of their own lived experience. One former German nurse, interviewed in the 1960s, put it simply. She said that her time in captivity forced her to separate what I was told from what I saw. That separation, historians argue, was one of the most powerful tools in dismantling extremist belief systems in the post-war era. It wasn't just about military defeat. It was about the deconstruction of a worldview. The epilogue of this story doesn't unfold on a battlefield, but in human memory. Long after the uniforms were folded away and the camps were dismantled, the lesson of that experience endured. Respect, offered without obligation, had achieved what violence alone never could. It had exposed the fragility of propaganda by replacing it with a simple, undeniable reality. In a war defined by unimaginable destruction, the quiet consistency of humane treatment became a powerful argument for another way of organizing power. Food served evenly, orders given calmly, work respected. In the end, it wasn't the force of arms that unsettled these nurses the most. It was the quiet, profound realization that dignity could exist even between enemies. And in that realization, an entire ideology began to lose its grip. Not just through defeat on the battlefield, but through the undeniable power of a better example. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more stories that explore the lesser-known corners of history. See you next time.